The fight for freedom continues. This is 2A Today.
The right of the people.
The right of the people.
The right of the people.
Shall not be infringed.
The right of the people.
To keep and bear.
The right of the people.
Shall not be infringed.
The right of the people.
Shall not
Be infringed.
Welcome to episode 33 of 2A Today. It's March 31st, 2015, and I'm your host, YaDaddy. And joining me via Skype from that all-too-natural state is Kevin. How's it going tonight, Kevin?
Oh, it's very natural here.
Anything exciting happening in gun rights in Arkansas right now?
Yes, there are many pro-gun bills being sent to the governor, and he will sign them because he's Asa Hutchinson.
Oh, okay. He's not going to veto them like some other governors have been doing lately?
No chance.
All right, good. All right, well, listen, folks, it's time for part 2 of our NFA series on 2A Today. And we've already heard from the lawyer, namely attorney Dean Phillips, about the reality of going through the NFA process of today. And let me tell you, it's some bull crap. I know because I'm doing it. So we talked about the present, but as always on the 2A Today program, we like to delve into the history of things. So tonight we're going to talk about how we got here. And joining us via phone is gun blogger extraordinaire Dean Weingarten of the GunWatch blog. Hey, you know, Kevin, that's 2 Deans in a row. I just realized that.
Yeah, it is.
How's it going tonight, Dean?
Going very well. I even had a working air conditioner today. We got temps up around 95 here in Yuma, Arizona.
Oh, yeah. So you're coming to us from one of the best gun states in the country, Arizona. Is that right?
It's true. We're way up there and trying to get better all the time.
Yeah, you got to keep moving. Can't sit still because they'll take it away from you if they get a half a chance. All right. Well, Dean, tell the folks, if you don't mind, why you are the person to talk to tonight. Give us a bit of your background, and I mean a bit, you know, because you got a resume that could stop a bus. So tell the audience a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm pretty close to a lot of the events that happened. You know, the 34 bill happened a little bit before World War II, and I was born just a little after it in 1951. And in 1968, I bought my first pistol across state lines for cash at a gun store without showing any ID, and it was all legal.
Wow.
So we've lost a lot of freedom over the intervening years, and I've seen it happen.
All right. So you're definitely our expert for this NFA history show. And at this point in the show, Dean, my usual co-host, Peter Gould, who is still busy filming, he's a busy boy, he has a question that he likes to ask of all our guests. And I wouldn't even pretend to do it as well as Peter does, but I'm going to give it a shot. Okay? So, basically, we're all folks that enjoy firearms. We got our start that way. And by one means or another, something happened in our lives that made us get into the Second Amendment activism game. And there's usually a moment in everyone's lives that gets into this when they said, I've had enough. And they decide, I'm going to start fighting back. So I got to ask you, Dean, in Peter's stead, what was your I've had enough moment?
Well, actually, I think it was about 1972 or 73. And I looked at what was happening with gun rights. We just lost the fight for GCA 68. Things were not looking good at all. The demographics looked bad. Everybody was facing more urbanization. Hunting was slowly degrading. There weren't as many hunters as there used to be. And it just looked like we were going to lose. We were just going to lose eventually. And I just looked at myself and took stock, and I said, I've got to keep on fighting. I've got to fight this because I can't live with myself if I don't keep fighting, even if we're going to lose.
All right. So we've all got a story, and there's Dean's. All right. Well, we got a lot to cover in this show, so let's dig into it. We're going to start moving in chronological order with the National Firearms Act of 1934. Officially, It's known as the Act of June 26, 1934, commonly referred to as 1934 NFA. And we're going to talk about what happened before the act actually occurred, before Congress did their thing. And Dean's going to help us with that. And Dean, it's my understanding, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong about this, but when you read about what led to NFA 34, everyone says that it was a combination of the Depression and Prohibition and the resulting organized crime wave. If you could tell us just a little bit about maybe your opinions on how the Depression might have played into leading up to 1934 NFA.
Well, people say that it was the Depression and the crime wave. I'm not at all convinced that it was. There was a sense, especially among the elites, from about 1900 on, that pistols needed to be controlled. And you had this desire to control pistols, especially among immigrants. You had the Sullivan Act in New York that was designed to protect organized crime. Big Tim Sullivan was an organized crime member of the Tammany Gang that was also a state legislator, and he's the one who pushed that law through. So I see the 1934 Act as primarily aimed at handguns, and full automatic weapons and short-barreled rifles and shotguns were kind of secondary to it all.
Yeah. And then, of course, after the Depression, we rolled into Prohibition.
Right, and Prohibition fueled the organized crime, and it served as a nexus for the papers to write about these gunfights, like that massacre down in Chicago that used a Thompson submachine gun, or the Bonnie and Clyde gang where they used sawed-off VARs that were, by the way, stolen from National Guard armories. And so there were a few stories that the media exaggerated and hyped to back up this desire to ban fully auto weapons, but really they were very, very seldom used in crime even back then. There just weren't very many of them around that were being used.
Yeah, so you're talking about the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago.
Yes,
yeah.
That's what I was talking about, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Yeah.
And it was a story. It was kind of like what you see with school shootings today, where you have a very isolated, very rare event, but it's broadcast all over the country and hyped and made into a cause célèbre to pass some kind of law.
Yeah, and when you start looking into this, as much reading as I've done on the web about this, I read the stories about what led up to the NFA 34 Act, and it seems so familiar to me, the story does. You mentioned a few high-profile acts. I mean, that's exactly what's happened in the past few years with gun control, is a few very high-profile acts have been shoved to the forefront and broadcast across the country nonstop. And then people start to get up in arms and say, oh, we've got to control guns. When in reality, crime is going down, violence is going down, and gun sales are going up. And it just seems like a story that keeps happening over and over again. It sounds incredibly familiar to today. Wouldn't you agree, Dean?
I would. And if you look at the statistics on crime, it was actually falling when they enacted the NFA of 34 as well, because Prohibition had already ended, and with the end of Prohibition, we had an abrupt drop in crimes.
Would you agree, though, that Prohibition and the crime wave resulting from Prohibition, would you believe that that was really the impetus behind pushing this? I mean, whether it was the behind-the-scenes inspiration or not, but do you think that's what people were saying at the time is, oh, you know, because of all this organized crime and all the gun battles in the streets, we need to do something about that? Was that really the inspiration for this?
Well, it depends what you mean is the cause. It was used by the media to push for more controls, to say that it was needed. It's sort of a yellow journalism thing. If the media wouldn't have hyped it, we probably wouldn't have gotten the controls. The other thing is that the NFA controls were just part of a whole package of much more control by the federal government, taking over what had been states' prerogatives before. It was part of a package of acts that was pushed by the Roosevelt administration. So it didn't happen just by itself. It was one of a whole group of acts, several of which were found to be unconstitutional.
Oh, I just find it fascinating, first, that media hype has been going on for such a long time.
About 100 years.
Such as the name, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. I realized there were 7 people killed. They were all mobsters. However, the name massacre. I mean, that's something that the media, I can just see them grabbing onto that and broadcasting it well, they weren't on 24 hours a day, but however many hours they were on.
They were on newsstands 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So you need to sell papers. You need to sell advertising for TV. I mean, that's something that will never change, is whoever's doing the press got to get paid.
Well, I think back then it probably was more of an economic motive. But what I see today, and I think even to a certain extent back then, is progressives were primarily journalists, a lot of them. And they saw journalism as a way to change society, to get their ideas across, to have people think in different ways about things. So there's always been a strong agenda as part of journalism, not just for economic reasons.
All right. So, Dean, as I was reading about NFA 34, I ran across something called the Uniform Revolver Act. Could you explain that for the audience?
Yes, after the Sullivan Act got passed in New York, and it's a pretty nasty law, and the National Rifle Association came up with something called the Uniform Revolver Act, which was a little better, not quite so restrictive. And they began pushing that as possible legislation around in various states. After all, most crime that's committed with firearms is committed with handguns. And so that was part of the regulatory sort of scheme that was floating around, was this act to regulate handguns pre-1934. Now, versions of it are things like it, or the Sullivan Act got enacted in parts of the Northeast in states around New York. But otherwise, it didn't get a lot of play. It wasn't successful in a lot of other places.
So the NRA at the time was trying to push a distraction maybe for gun reform?
No, the NRA at the time was not politically active like it is today. It was sort of a good old boys club that was an insider in Washington. And they didn't want revolvers to be completely regulated so nobody could get them, but they felt they could be regulated to keep them out of the hands of the wrong people.
Okay, so they were kind of trying to pull that energy towards something that would be less harmful to regular gun owners. Is that right?
A bit less. They didn't want to see the Sullivan Act spread across the nation.
Yeah, and we've heard about the Sullivan Act on this show. In our Battleground State show for New York City, thanks to Glenn Herman, we got a good old earful about the Sullivan Act. But, Dean, give me a little bit about what you think about the Sullivan Act as the godfather of all gun control.
Well, it's not quite the godfather, but it is precedential for a lot of handgun acts that were passed around in the Northeast. And the purpose of the Sullivan Act is very clear. It was to protect organized crime in New York City. The Tammany Gang controlled New York City, and Big Tim Sullivan was one of the primary heads or bosses in the Tammany Gang. And he got elected to the state legislature, and then he went in the legislature and got the Sullivan Act passed so that they could prevent people from being armed against their enforcers in the Tammany Gang.
Nice. Kevin, you got anything?
Oh, I was just giggling a little bit because nothing has changed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, what do you see in Chicago today?
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. And another point that you might want to discuss with us, Dean, is the things that NFA 34 went after, which was primarily short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, suppressors, and machine guns. These were supposedly the weapons of organized crime, definitely in the press. I got to imagine that a news article on a criminal holding up a bank with a pistol isn't that exciting and probably doesn't make the papers.
Well, I think that when the NFA passed, there were some very lurid stories about people using fully automatic weapons. Bonnie and Clyde with their National Guard stolen BARs, or some of the very few Thompson submachine guns that were out there being used in the Valentine Day massacre. But most crime was committed by pistols. I really think, with pistols. It's a real distinction there. Crime is not committed by guns, it's committed with guns. But I think the 34 Act was aimed primarily at pistols and handguns because that's what's used in crime. And they just added in these other things as almost an afterthought. Fully automatic weapons, gun mufflers, and short-barreled rifles and shotguns. I really believe short-barreled rifles and shotguns were only added because it didn't make any sense to regulate handguns when anybody could buy a rifle or a shotgun and a hacksaw and in 15 minutes have a functional handgun. So short-barreled rifles and shotguns only made sense to regulate if you were going to regulate handguns very heavily.
Yeah, and I imagine that as today, where criminals primarily use handguns because they're very concealable, you don't see criminals running around with machine guns usually, or short-barreled rifles or short-barreled shotguns, because even though they're cut down, they're still not that concealable.
Well, if you make them small enough, they become concealable, but the fact is that criminals would prefer regular handguns if they can get them, and that's what most crime is committed with.
Yeah, they're easier to acquire. They can be stolen from people. You know, other people can acquire them and, you know, give them to them.
Make your own.
Yeah, make your own. But back before 1934, I imagine criminals were probably doing the same thing. They really were most likely just using pistols for the most part.
And pistols were easily available since, easily before 1900. There was a whole group of pistols called suicide specials, relatively inexpensive pistols sold by mail order. And they were, you could buy a pistol. That's where the term $2 pistol comes from. You could buy pistols relatively inexpensively.
Yeah, so they were cheap, they were plentiful, they were easily concealed. That kind of sounds like a good tool for a criminal. So I don't think anything's really changed in all this time. It's the same story today as it was in the past. But somebody got a bug in their ear and decided they wanted to go after a whole bunch of other stuff too, and we're paying the price for it even today. And that particular thing is the 1934 National Firearms Act, as I call it. And I'm going to run it down for you right now. We're going to give some facts as they stand about NFA 34. So I'm going to just roll out some information, and then we'll talk about the reality of that. So the National Firearms Act, which is actually referred to originally as the Act of June 26, 1934, and which obviously was enacted on June 26, 1934. In general, it imposes a statutory excise tax on the manufacture and transfer of certain firearms and mandates the registration of those firearms. The act was passed shortly after the repeal of Prohibition. The impetus for the National Firearms Act of 1934 was the gangland crime of the Prohibition era, such as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929 and the attempted assassination of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. The 1934 Act required NFA firearms to be registered and taxed. The $200 tax was quite prohibitive at the time, equivalent to $3,526 in this year of 2015. With a few exceptions, the tax amount is unchanged to this day. $200, not such a big deal now. Originally, pistols and revolvers were to be regulated as strictly as machine guns. Towards that end, cutting down a rifle or shotgun to circumvent the handgun restrictions by making a concealable weapon was taxed as strictly as a machine gun. Conventional pistols and revolvers were ultimately excluded from the act before passage, but other concealable weapons were not. Under the original act, NFA weapons were machine guns, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, and any other weapons, or AOW, concealable weapons other than pistols or revolvers. And silencers were included for any type of NFA or non-NFA item. Minimum barrel length was originally 18 inches for shotguns and rifles, but was soon amended to 16 inches for rimfire rifles, and by 1960 had been amended to 16 inches for centerfire rifles as well. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1968 decided the case of Haynes versus United States in favor of the defendant, which effectively gutted the National Act of 1934. As one could possess an NFA firearm and choose not to register it and not face prosecution due to Fifth Amendment protections. The act, as it turned out, was unenforceable. To deal with this, Congress rewrote the act to make registration of existing weapons impossible except by the government. So there's a bunch of facts and information from the web. I didn't write that myself, obviously. So 1934 rolls along, Dean, and we end up with this act. And what is the actual, as you may understand, the net result of this act showing up? What happened in the country? What happened to gun owners?
Well, not a lot to start with. First off, when the act was passed in 34, it was understood everywhere that it only applied to guns that moved across state lines. And so there wasn't a lot of opposition. If you had a short-barreled rifle or a shotgun, you just didn't go across state lines with it, and you felt like you were relatively secure. So it wasn't until later, after World War II, when the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government could regulate almost anything under the Commerce Clause if it, quote, affected interstate commerce. So if it had ever been an interstate commerce, they were then saying that it could be regulated by the federal government. Before that, for example, in the Miller case, that short-barreled shotgun actually had traveled across state lines. That was a key part of the case.
And this whole NFA 34 thing, it really was a tax. It was a way of raising money and to limit the availability of these items. And really only rich people could have them as a result. Is that right?
Well, that's true, but it really never was the purpose of the NFA to raise money, because it just didn't raise hardly anybody. Nobody could afford this $200 tax. It'd be like $3,000 today. I mean, paying a $3,000 tax for what at the time might have been a $100 item, like a gun muffler, it just didn't make any sense. So it raised virtually no money. Everybody understood that its real purpose was to register guns and to keep people from getting guns. I think that if it ever got actually challenged, one thing that the courts have held is that a tax actually has to have a purpose of raising money. You can't just pass a tax to be a de facto regulation of some other kind.
Ah, interesting. Dean, you mentioned the Miller case, and you've got a very interesting story to tell about a certain judge involving that. But could you give the audience a little bit of a background on what the Miller case is in case they don't know, and then tell us about that judge?
Yeah, the Miller case was the first case that challenged the 1934 National Firearms Act in federal court. And it was appealed to the Supreme Court. And basically the Supreme Court said, you didn't give us some pertinent facts, so we're upholding it but sending it back to you to re-adjudicate. Now, the really interesting thing is the judge who created the case, essentially, was Hartzell Ragon of Arkansas. And he was the Charles Schumer of his day. He was a representative in Congress when Franklin Roosevelt got elected, and he was rabidly anti-gun. He didn't believe that handguns were at all covered under the Second Amendment, and he thought they could be just regulated out of existence and didn't have a problem with it. He was literally the Charles Schumer of his day. Well, he left Congress to take a judgeship, a federal judgeship in Arkansas that Franklin Roosevelt appointed him to. And it was while he was in that judgeship that he came across this case of Miller. And Miller had an associate whose name I don't remember right now. And they were longtime career criminals, and they transported a short-barreled shotgun across state lines. They wanted to cut a deal, at least Miller did, I believe both of them, where they would plead guilty and get a reduced sentence. But Judge Ragon would have nothing of it. He insisted that they plead not guilty. He wouldn't take a guilty plea from them. And then he crafted the Miller case to go higher up in federal court. He appointed the defense attorney for Miller and his associate, then forced them to plead not guilty, then ruled that the 1934 Act was unconstitutional and put together the defense for it as being unconstitutional. Now, it sounds a little strange, but think, if you're trying to undermine the Second Amendment, how much better to do it than to create the defense of the Second Amendment yourself that's so weak that it won't work. And then in a highly unusual situation, the case was appealed not to the appeals court level, but directly to the Supreme Court. So they skipped over the appeals court. Then the lawyer that the judge had appointed never filed a defense in the Miller case at the Supreme Court level. So only the government side was heard in the Miller case at the Supreme Court, and that's why they came down to a kind of wishy-washy ruling. Now, as I read it, they basically said, well, yes, everybody has a right to keep and bear arms, but we see that they have to have some relationship to a well-regulated militia. And nobody has given us any evidence that a short-barreled shotgun is used by a militia. Therefore, we're sending it back down to the court to retry it. And by that time, Miller was either dead or gone somewhere in his associate. And of course, the judge had no interest, now that he got a ruling that he pretty much wanted, in retrying the case. So that's how we ended up with U.S. v. Miller.
Nice.
Wow.
Well, let me make a comment about the Miller case. Like I said, the Miller case was a little bit ambiguous, but almost immediately the appeals court started completely disregarding what it actually said and claiming something completely different. They claimed that under Miller, there was no individual right to bear arms. But that's not what Miller said at all. And yet those appeals court cases were just left to stand for years and years and years and accumulate. And the Supreme Court after that, which basically had been packed with Roosevelt appointees, just refused to hear any appeals based on Miller.
Wow.
Kevin, how does it feel to hear the Chuck Schumer of Arkansas?
Well, it doesn't make me proud. I'll say that.
Is it possible today to have one of those?
I don't believe so.
All right. Yeah, I don't think Arkansas would allow that.
Judge Ragon does have descendants there, and I think that there is a Ragon in politics. He probably wouldn't want to be reminded about this particular episode in his family history.
You need to get the word out, Kevin. Get the word out there.
I'll get right on that.
All right. Kevin, do you have anything before I move on?
Oh, this is fascinating and just infuriating at the same time.
Yep. All right. Well, let's move a bit into the future from 1934. The next big event that gives us what we have today to deal with is referred to as the Gun Control Act of 1968. And I'll give you a few facts about that from the good old internet. The Gun Control Act of 1968 is a U.S. federal law that regulates the firearms industry and firearms owners. It primarily focuses on regulating interstate commerce in firearms by generally prohibiting interstate firearms transfers, except among licensed manufacturers, dealers, and importers. The GCA was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on October 22, 1968. Passage of the Gun Control Act was prompted by the assassinations of U.S. President John F. Kennedy in 1963, Nation of Islam leader Malcolm X in 1965, the 1966 University of Texas mass shootings, Martin Luther King Jr. in April of 1968 assassinated, and U.S. Senator Robert F. Kennedy in June of 1968. Some of the primary things that GCA 68 did was define prohibited persons. Under the GCA, selling of firearms to certain categories of individuals is prohibited. It created the federal firearms license system. The Gun Control Act mandated the licensing of individuals and companies engaged in the business of selling firearms. This provision effectively prohibited the direct mail order of firearms, except antiques, by consumers and mandated that anyone who wants to buy a gun in an interstate transaction from a source other than a private individual must do so through a federally licensed firearms dealer. The act also banned unlicensed individuals from acquiring handguns outside their state of residence. So guess what, guys? That's where all that came from. GCA 68 also gave us import restrictions. It added a sporting purpose, quote-unquote sporting purpose, test, which barred imports of military surplus rifles, and a points system for imported handguns, which barred from importation handguns based on penalizing features, short barrel, small caliber, short overall length or height, non-adjustable sights, etc., believed actually to define the Saturday night special class of handgun. So that's where all that fun stuff came from, Kevin. This sounds really familiar to me right now. Mm-hmm. And then we also got the marking requirements from GCA 68. The law required that all newly manufactured firearms produced by licensed manufacturers in the United States and imported into the United States bear a serial number. Firearms manufactured prior to the Gun Control Act and firearms manufactured by non-FFLs remained exempt from the serial number requirement. Defacement or removal of a serial number is a felony offense, thanks to GCA 68. So there are just some good hardcore facts about GCA 68. Dean, how did that one feel? when it happened?
Well, it was really bad because you had a lot of businesses that were based on selling firearms through the mail. And I think two of the primary reasons, the pushes for GCA 68 behind the scenes, were one, that American manufacturers wanted to cut out the competition they were getting from a lot of cheap military firearms being imported into the United States to compete with those rifles made by Remington and Winchester and Savage. And then the other, I think, motivation was to cut funding for the NRA. Franklin Roosevelt, back in the 30s, had seen that the NRA was a powerful enough force back then that he didn't want to mess with it too much. And in 68, it had gained popularity and power. But the NRA got a lot of its funding from ads for mail-order guns, particularly surplus military guns coming from overseas. I remember those pre-68 American Rifleman magazines, and they just had numerous full-page advertisements for buying guns mail order. So I think that a good bit of the motivation for GCA 68 on the part of Lyndon Johnson, who was a pretty slimy politician, was to cut the funding for the NRA. But it had a perverse effect. It had unintended consequences, as they say. When that funding for the NRA went away, the NRA had to depend on its members more and more. And the membership was much more hardcore than the NRA was. They wanted to protect themselves politically, and the NRA was forced to become more political as it had to answer to its members.
Sound familiar, Kevin?
Yes.
Sounds like it's all happening over and over again, doesn't it?
It does.
And speaking of that, we have in the facts that I just read, they basically mentioned, there was a bunch of assassinations, several high-profile incidents that it was an emotional reaction to restrict handguns. Yeah.
It's this bait-and-switch technique, too. The assassinations of Martin Luther King and Kennedy and the shooting from the Whitman Tower were all done with rifles. And yet GCA really came down much harder on pistols than on rifles.
Yeah.
And that may make a little bit of sense, but one wit at the time said, we get all these crimes committed with rifles, and they come down hard on pistols. So it really was kind of a very similar bait and switch, where you have Adam Lanza kills his mother and steals her rifle, so they say we have to have more background checks.
Yes, and even the people that are proposing it say it wouldn't have stopped him.
Right.
And you mentioned how the NRA was, I think you would agree, was kind of transformed by this whole GCA 68 and how they lost their income from ads and then had to lean on membership dues, and thereby making the whole NRA community much more vibrant and grow and become more powerful. I mean,
before 68, the NRA just was not all that political. The ILA, Institute for Legislative Action, didn't exist. So they were not nearly as effective as a lobby body as they've become. The NRA has become more and more politically effective as they've basically been forced to defend the gun culture against all the power that the elites are bringing to bear to try to destroy it.
Yes, I guess you would say that GCA 68 kind of backfired on itself a little bit, wouldn't you think?
Yes, exactly, because the NRA became much more political. The other things that happened, for example, when I was growing up, almost every hardware store, every gas station often sold pistols and rifles and shotguns and ammunition.
Gas stations? Are you serious?
Oh, yeah. I remember going to the Holiday gas station up in Hayward, Wisconsin. I was growing up and buying 22 shells. It'll sound great. At 44 cents a box. And it was commonplace. So what the GCA 68 did is by putting on these regulations requiring a license, it made it harder. There was a disincentive put on for ordinary small stores to then have this extra paperwork they had to do to sell rifles and shotguns and such. So it concentrated gun selling and ammunition selling into dedicated gun shops, which were not nearly as common before the act as after. And then those dedicated gun shops became nodes of activism where the gun culture met and discussed legislation and signed petitions and met each other and made connections.
So, Kevin, can you imagine a time when you would just go to your hardware store or your gas station and buy a pistol and some ammunition?
Well, I'm old enough to remember the hardware stores and the guns hanging on the wall and being able to purchase them. So, yeah, I don't have to imagine it. It was part of my existence. There was probably an age limit. I don't know what it was. I was maybe 8 or 10 years old at that time. So I doubt they would have sold me a rifle. They might have.
Well, one of the things we've lost that was during just recent events in 94 to 98 is that through most of this period, rifles and shotguns hardly regulated at all. You couldn't buy them through the mail, but you could pretty much buy them without much fuss. It wasn't until after 94 that rifles and shotguns were included as guns that had to go through an instant check. Before that, I'm not sure you even had to fill out a 4473 for rifles and shotguns. What people often don't remember about GCA 68 is that before it, you could buy anti-tank weapons and ammunition and anti-aircraft weapons and ammunition through the mail, and people did, had to have a little money to do it, and there wasn't any problem with them. They were not used in crime. That situation existed in Switzerland up until, I think it was 1998, 96 or 98 when they changed their law there. And Switzerland didn't have any problem. You could buy artillery, you could buy mortars, you could buy all that stuff in Switzerland. You had to be a citizen. It was about like buying a pistol in the United States. And the government said, well, for safety reasons, you store the breech block separately from the gun. But other than that, you could buy them, and it was relatively easy in most of the cantons.
Wow. Hasn't even been that long, and things are so different. It's just so different. All right. So GCA 68 really kind of transformed the gun community. And is there anything else that GCA 68 did that you can remember you might want to tell us about?
Well, remember, GCA 68 was a lot worse in 68 and 69 because what happened later in 86 is we reformed a lot of it. After 60 and 69, BATF or agents were going around and raiding people, and I think it was in 68 or 69 that they raided a place near D.C., might have been in Virginia. I think the fellow's name was Kevin Ballou, and basically burst in without good cause and shot him in the head as he grabbed an unloaded, I think, black powder gun to try and defend himself.
Jeez.
And he was paralyzed and still is, as far as I can say. But that case became a cause célèbre, and it's one of the reasons that we got some pushback and a little bit of lightening of some of the worst parts of GCA 68.
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of nasty things started happening after GCA 68, and I think a lot of gun owners felt a threat, and there was a lot of active going after of folks over their firearms. And
well, it happens today still quite a lot. I think it may happen even more. At least we're seeing it more. We have the communications. You didn't have it back then. If it didn't happen in your backyard, or if the NRA didn't cover it in the American Rifleman, you didn't hear about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, that led to what is referred to as the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986. And this particular legislative act, it started out as a way to protect gun owners, but we kind of ended up with a machine gun ban as part of that. Is that right, Dean?
Yes, that's correct. There's a video somewhere on the net where you can see the vote where they enacted the ban on more machine guns. And even that ban is kind of ambiguous. It's just been pushed as hard as it can by the BATF. Originally, 86 was pushed forward by the Institute for Legislative Action in the NRA to correct the worst abuses of GCA 68. And I believe he was the head of ILA at the time, Neil Knox, a brilliant guy. I met him several times. Unfortunately, died a few years ago. And he pushed hard to get the best possible deal that we could in the 1986 law. He pushed so hard that he got some pushback from the NRA, and they actually booted him out of the NRA. But we managed through special legislative procedure where if you got enough congressmen to sign on. They could force a bill to come up before the House of Representatives, whether the leadership wanted it to or not. And they forced a vote that way. They got, I think it was a majority of congressmen to sign this special action that allowed that vote. But to do so, they had to eliminate the rules of the House briefly in order to get the act through. Well, they got it through, and then I believe Charles Rangel was presiding as a temporary Speaker of the House at the time, and immediately after they passed it, one of his cronies said, "Consider amendment such and such." And Rangel said, "The amendment is considered. All those in favor, say aye." And you got a few ayes, aye. And then those opposed and a bunch of nays, and he says, "The ayes have it." And it was obviously, with the rules of the House not being in effect, they could push through anything they wanted to. So somebody said, call for adjournment or something to that effect, and they had stopped it. Otherwise, I'm convinced they would have gone on to try to make gun mufflers as equally hard to get as automatic firearms under the 86 law. But that's how we got the limit on any further production of automatic weapons for civilian hands in 86. And you can find that video on the net if you look hard enough. I did, but I don't have a place I can send you to right now.
Well, Dean, I have a place that I can send everyone to right now. This is YaDaddy breaking in with a post-recording update. If you want to see the video that Dean is talking about, just go to youtube.com and search FOPA, F-O-P-A, and the name Hughes, H-U-G-H-E-S. So FOPA and Hughes. And at the top, you'll find two videos. They're of the same thing. And you can watch the House of Representatives session that Dean is talking about. And it's pretty disgusting. So go enjoy and watch your freedoms being stolen from you. Now, back to your regularly scheduled podcast.
You said Charles Rangel. He's still in there, isn't he?
Yeah, he is.
Okay.
I thought it was Tip O'Neill at first until I started digging. And then I believe, and I'm going by memory here, so my memory can be faulty, but I believe it was Charles Rangel who was the temporary Speaker of the House that called that voice vote to be opposite of what everybody else heard.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It was. I came across that in my reading.
He's been in trouble for taxes now, but he gets a pass.
All right. Yeah, we didn't give gun owners a pass back then in 1986, unfortunately, and now we're stuck with no more machine guns, no new machine guns.
Well, actually, you guys know there's a court case that's challenging it now in Texas.
Huh?
No.
Yeah, in the District Court of North Dallas.
Do tell.
They're saying that it violates the Second Amendment because there's no logical reason for it.
Mm-hmm.
They're saying, if it's okay for somebody to have a gun that was made before 1986, why can't somebody have one that was made the day after?
Sure.
And they quote the statistics of all the automatic, or I guess you could call fully automatic guns that were registered, and there's 100,000 of them, before 1986. Up until 1986, there was only one murder committed with those legal machine guns,
mm-hmm.
and that was committed by a police officer.
Yeah.
So they have a stellar record of having virtually no crime with them, and yet they stopped the production of further ones for the civilian market. It made absolutely no sense. It doesn't even pass the rational basis test. So this court case out of the North District in Dallas basically says it's a fundamental right. You've got to have some reason to restrict it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just restrict it because you want to.
Yeah. So when this went down in 86 and this machine gun ban essentially kind of slipped under the door, what was the reaction in the gun community at the time, Dean? Was there a bunch of uproar, or was it just kind of accepted?
Oh, yeah. There was a lot of disgust about it. But the reforms that we did get in 86 were pretty significant. And we worked really hard to get that 86 law passed. I mean, imagine if you've got the whole leadership in the House. Oh, gee, that's not so hard. Trying to do just the opposite of what most of the members and what most of the people in the country want, how hard it is to get an act through. And we managed to do it. And then I think purely as payback, purely as saying we're not going to let this pass without another step toward gun control, they put in this restriction on further manufacture of machine guns for citizens, for ordinary civilians. And it did not go over well, but we couldn't get any traction in the courts. They just refused to hear the cases that were brought. And so we've been just living with it.
Yeah, and we all know that a registered machine gun today is going to run you anywhere from $10,000 to $35,000, $40,000. What did machine guns cost back before '86?
Well, a friend of mine got an MP5 converted. I think it was a HK94. That was, let's see, was that a 9mm? I'm believing. Anyway, he got that converted to a, short-barreled, fully auto machine gun. And I think it was less than $1,000 for the whole thing, including the $200 tax.
Wow. Yeah, so that limitation on the number of machine guns that can exist in the United States made the prices go absolutely through the roof. What a great way to control guns, make them super incredibly expensive.
Well, and they just were never used in crime. They're not really great crime guns.
Yeah, I can't afford to shoot them anyway. So
well, and that's the other thing. Most people just look at how much ammunition costs and say, semi-auto is fine for me.
Yeah. Wouldn't mind having a full auto AK, though. That's one thing I wouldn't mind having at all.
Well, a suppressed full auto 22 might be kind of fun, too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that'd be fun. They're all fun. They're all fun. Okay. So that's the brief story behind NFA 34, GCA 68, and the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986. Well, let's start talking about some brass tacks, okay? You've alluded a little bit to this for me, Dean, about things that were really going on behind the scenes, but what do you think the real reason for NFA 34 was? Do you really think they were just trying to get a handgun ban?
Well, part of it was that, as I mentioned, Roosevelt was pushing forward this whole raft of expansive laws that increased government power. And the NFA Act was just one of them. There were all these laws that regulated how people could trade. Farm subsidies were put into effect so that your farming was controlled by the government. The minimum wage laws went into effect. Social Security was put into effect. Just many parts, different parts of federal control over the economy and people's lives were all put into effect by the Roosevelt administration. And the NFA was one of those. It was, I believe, mostly aimed at pistols, but they also put in this other stuff just as a way of getting more control by the government over people's lives.
Well, that seems very familiar today, too. I'm convinced that those that are trying to push further restrictions, really, their motivation is to prove that they can't be beaten by the NRA. So they could care less about human life. It's more vindictive, like, we're going to show the NRA who's boss.
Well, another part of it is it's a basic philosophy of government. The Constitution and most American, well, virtually all American law is passed under this premise. Everything is legal except what is forbidden. Whereas I believe most statists and progressive go on the opposite premise. Everything is forbidden except what is allowed.
And what we grant to you.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Only what the government grants is allowed. Everything else you can't do.
And if they can grant it, then they can take it away.
Exactly. Which is why they proclaim that, natural rights are a stupid idea and often seem to even poo-poo the whole idea of natural rights, which is what the Constitution and our whole system of government was founded on.
Exactly.
So it seems like at least since the early part of the 1900s, there's been a pretty steady march by certain people to take away our access to firearms, to limit our freedom, and to get control of the U.S. public to the point where they can't defend themselves. I mean, do you see this as an overarching kind of, I don't know, maybe organic plan by a certain group of people to accomplish a certain task?
I think that it's part and parcel of this philosophy of progressivism. back around 1900 or so, when progressivism was really starting to take off, what they said was, the frontier is over, the Constitution's out of date, we need a new plan where we can really do great things. And we can't do great things with this Constitution restricting us all everywhere we turn around trying to do something great. So we've got to just kind of junk the Constitution and not pay any attention to it. And so we can do wonderful, great stuff. I mean, that was certainly what Roosevelt was coming from. And we've morphed. I mean, at least back then you had leaders saying, we're going to make a great country. Now, progressivism seems to have gotten to, we've got to destroy the United States to protect the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, then who would protect the rest of the world? I think that's what we've been doing.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is fascinating, Dean. I think we've got a lot of good information to explain how we ended up where we are today. I think we got a much better picture. We started in this first show in the NFA series with what's the state of today. We've now discovered a good bit about how we got here. And the next episode, we're going to talk about how we can change this. So we're going to be joined by Knox Williams of the American Suppressor Association. Right now, we got to kind of wrap it up. We're out of time. I really appreciate Kevin and Dean joining me tonight. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me for this episode. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Happy to join you.
Absolutely. And before I go, Dean, you've got some stuff you do on the web. You want to tell the audience how they can find you on the web and keep up with what you're doing?
Yes. Just do a Google search or any other kind of search for GunWatch. I put everything I write on there, and a lot of it appears on places like AmmoLand or Truth About Guns, Concealed Nation.
All right. And if you would like to get in touch with this Second Amendment effort, that is the 2A Today podcast, you can email us at 2atodaypodcast@gmail.com. You can follow us on Twitter at 2AToday, or you can like us on Facebook at facebook.com/2AToday. And 2A Today is spelled, of course, the number 2, the letter A, the letter T, and O-Day all together. And if you want to follow the show, links to every episode go up on Twitter and Facebook. But the easiest way to get the show is to subscribe to 2A Today on iTunes and leave a rave 5-star review. And we also can be found on TuneIn Radio for all the Android folks out there. All right, well, at the end of every show, we like to leave you, the listening audience, with some words of significance surrounding the Second Amendment. And this episode's 2A quote is from firearms legend Jeff Cooper. If you are not familiar with who Jeff Cooper is, then you need to listen to some 2A Today back catalog. It's been covered. Jeff Cooper had this to say, and I think it's appropriate. All the people constitute the militia, according to the Founding Fathers. Therefore, every able-bodied man has a duty under the Constitution to become part of the well-regulated militia, specifically to understand and perform well with the individual weapon currently issued to the regular establishment. Thus, one who has not qualified himself with the M16 may not be considered to be a responsible citizen. And Jeff, I'll take a 14.5-inch barreled select fire version of the M4 if you don't mind, which unfortunately would require this NFA nonsense I'm having to go through, and a whole boatload of cash. Screw it. I'll just make mine an automatic Kalashnikov, a pattern rifle. Don't worry about it. All right. Well, that's all the time we've got for the show. I'm your host, YaDaddy, and I'd like to end with a simple but very important question. Are we going to be a free people? Dean, are we going to be a free people?
We will be a free people, but it won't be cheap. It'll take the Churchillian coin, blood, sweat, and tears.
Absolutely. I agree. Join us next time on 2A Today, and we will help you answer that question. That's it. 2A Today. Over.